I am currently pressed so flat against the cold marble floor of the upstairs hallway that I can feel the vibration of a heavy door slamming shut somewhere on the first floor. My breath is coming in shallow, jagged hitches that I am desperately trying to swallow, because in this massive, echoing estate, the sound of a single gasp for air travels like a scream. I have spent the last 3 hours playing a deadly game of hide and seek with 4 people who think they are alone in an abandoned mansion, and the only thing keeping me alive is the fact that they haven't checked the linen closet behind the grand staircase yet. My parents are currently halfway across the Atlantic Ocean on a business trip to London, leaving me in charge of the sprawling, 6-bedroom fortress that has always felt more like a museum than a home. Because our house is tucked away at the end of a private, wooded drive and is surrounded by high stone walls, it looks like the perfect target for anyone looking for a place to disappear for a few weeks. I was supposed to be at a friend's house for the weekend, but a sudden fever had me staying home in bed, a decision that I now realize might be the last one I ever make. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when I heard the sound of a heavy vehicle pulling up the gravel driveway, which was strange because we weren't expecting any deliveries or guests. I peered through the slats of the wooden blinds in my bedroom and saw a rusted, beat-up van idling near the front entrance, its headlights turned off to avoid detection. 4 figures stepped out, dressed in oversized hoodies and carrying heavy duffel bags, moving toward the front door with a level of confidence that suggested they believed the house was completely vacant. I watched in a state of frozen shock as one of them pulled out a set of professional-grade lockpicks and began working on the heavy oak door with a methodical, practiced rhythm. Within seconds, the heavy bolt clicked open, and the group shuffled inside, their voices low but filled with a terrifying sense of ownership as they began to discuss which rooms they would occupy. They weren't there to steal the television or the silverware. They were squatters who had been watching the house for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to move in and claim it as their own. This place is a goldmine. We could stay here for a month before anyone even notices we're living in the guest wing. A woman's voice whispered, her laughter sending a wave of ice water through my veins. I knew that if I made a sound or tried to run for the stairs, they would find me, and people who break into homes to live in them don't usually react well to finding a witness who can call the police. I realized my phone was sitting on the nightstand across the room, but the floorboards in my bedroom are notoriously loud, and the intruders were currently standing directly in the foyer below me. I began to crawl toward the phone, every inch of movement feeling like an eternity as I listened to the sounds of cabinets being opened and furniture being moved around in the kitchen. Just as my fingers brushed the cool glass of my phone, I heard the heavy thud of footsteps starting to ascend the grand staircase, accompanied by the whistling of a tune that sounded horribly cheerful. "I'm going to check the master suite, see if the beds are made," a man called out, his voice getting louder with every step he took toward the second floor. I didn't have time to call for help, so I shoved the phone into my pocket and scrambled into the small, dark space of the linen closet just as the bedroom door swung open. Through the narrow gap in the closet door, I could see the silhouette of a tall man standing in the center of my room, his shadow stretching across the floor like a dark stain. He walked over to my bed and ran his hand across the rumpled sheets, his movements slowing down as he realized the blankets were still warm from my body heat. "Hey, Sarah, get up here. I think we have a guest," he yelled, his voice stripping away any hope I had of remaining undetected for the rest of the night. I felt a surge of pure, primal adrenaline as I heard the other 3 members of the group racing up the stairs, their footsteps sounding like a stampede on the hardwood floors. I knew that the moment they opened this closet door, my life would be over, so I had to find a way to get out of this room and into the attic crawl space before they could surround me. I waited until I heard them all gathered around the bed, whispering in frantic, hushed tones about what to do with the problem they had just discovered. While they were distracted by the heat of the bed, I slowly pushed open the closet door and slipped out into the hallway, moving with a silence that I didn't know I was capable of. I reached the pull-down ladder for the attic just as I heard the man shout, "He's in the house! Search every room now!" The next hour was a blur of high-stakes navigation as I moved through the dark, dusty rafters of the attic, listening to the intruders smashing doors and tossing furniture in the rooms below me. Every time I moved a muscle, the old would groan under my weight, and I would freeze, praying that the insulation would muffle the sound enough to keep them guessing. I could hear them arguing below, their voices becoming more desperate and aggressive as they realized I was outsmarting them in my own home. "If we find him, we have to finish it. We can't let him go to the cops after he's seen our faces," the woman said, her voice cold and devoid of any hesitation. That was the moment I realized that I wasn't just hiding from burglars. I was hiding from people who were willing to commit murder to protect their new sanctuary. I reached the small circular window at the peak of the attic and realized it was the only way out, but it was a 20-foot drop to the bushes below. I pulled my phone out and saw that I finally had a single bar of service, enough to send a frantic text to my neighbor who is a retired police officer. "Intruders in the house. Attic. Help." I typed, my thumbs shaking so hard I almost dropped the device through the floor joists. I watched the delivered icon appear, and then I waited in the suffocating heat of the attic, listening to the sound of the intruders climbing the ladder just a few feet away from my hiding spot. The attic door creaked open, and the beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the spiderwebs and old trunks that filled the space. I tucked myself behind a massive chimney stack, holding my breath until my lungs burned, watching the light bounce off the walls as the man searched the corners. Just as the light was about to land on my shoes, the sound of a distant, wailing siren began to echo through the woods, growing louder with every passing second. The man froze, the light wavering in his hand as he realized the police were turning into the long driveway with their lights flashing. "Go! Go! The cops are here!" he screamed, and I heard the chaotic sounds of the group scrambling back down the ladder and racing toward the rear exit of the house. I didn't move until I heard the heavy boots of the police officers bursting through the front door and the shouting of orders that meant the nightmare was finally over. The intruders were caught trying to scale the back wall, and I was eventually helped down from the attic by a group of officers who looked shocked that a kid had managed to stay hidden for so long. As I sat on the back of an ambulance wrapped in a shock blanket, I looked up at the massive, dark silhouette of my house and realized that no matter how many locks you have, a home is only as safe as the silence within it. I am currently crouched inside the narrow, dark gap between the furnace and the concrete wall of my basement, listening to the rhythmic scraping of a metal tool against the floorboards just inches from my head. The sound is slow and deliberate, a taunting reminder that the person searching for me isn't in a rush because he knows every exit in this house is locked from the outside. It is a terrifying realization when you discover that a stranger has spent the last 4 hours memorizing the layout of your home while you were upstairs playing video games and eating snacks. My parents had listed our house for sale last week, and today was the first big open house event where dozens of strangers were invited to walk through our private spaces and peer into our closets. I had spent the afternoon at the library to stay out of the way, and when I returned at 6 o'clock, the real estate agent told me the event was a huge success and that everyone had left. But as I locked the front door and began to settle in for a quiet night alone, I didn't realize that one of those potential buyers had never actually walked out the door. The first sign that something was wrong came when I went into the kitchen to grab a glass of water and noticed that the basement door, which I specifically remember closing earlier, was standing slightly ajar. I brushed it off as a draft from the old windows, but then I saw a single, muddy footprint on the white tile that didn't match any of my shoes or my parents' boots. My heart skipped a beat as I looked at that mark, realizing that while the real estate agent was packing up her signs in the front yard, someone had been slipping into the shadows of the lower level. I stood in the center of the kitchen, paralyzed by the sudden, heavy silence of the house, wondering if I should run out the front door or investigate the noise. Just as I reached for the handle of the front door, I heard the distinct, heavy thud of the deadbolt being turned from the outside, followed by the sound of a key snapping off in the lock. My breath caught in my throat as I realized I was being intentionally sealed inside, and the person who did it was still standing right behind me in the darkness of the hallway. "You really should have left with the others. It would have been much cleaner that way," a voice whispered from the shadows near the pantry, sounding calm and disturbingly polite. I didn't look back to see his face. I simply bolted for the only other exit I knew, which was the heavy sliding glass door leading to the back deck. But as I gripped the handle, I saw that it had been jammed with a thick wooden dowel placed in the track, making it impossible to slide open more than an inch. I was trapped in a glass cage with a man who had spent his afternoon pretending to be a buyer while planning a home invasion, and the sun was setting fast, casting long, jagged shadows across the living room. I realized my only hope was to get to the basement where my father keeps his heavy-duty tools and where there is a small coal chute window that might be big enough for me to crawl through. I dived through the basement door and sprinted down the wooden stairs, the person behind me not even running, but walking with a slow, confident stride that made my skin crawl. I reached the bottom of the stairs and scrambled into the maze of storage bins and old furniture, my mind racing through every possible way to defend myself. Why was he doing this? Was he looking for money? Or was he someone who simply enjoyed the hunt of a cornered victim in a house they thought was safe? I could hear him reaching the bottom of the stairs, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic, echoing off the cold stone walls like a ticking clock. I know this house better than you do now. I spent 3 hours checking the structural integrity of every door and window, he called out, his voice bouncing off the furnace and making it impossible to tell exactly where he was standing. I squeezed myself further into the gap behind the heating unit, the smell of dust and old oil filling my nostrils as I tried to disappear into the masonry. I watched his shadow grow long on the floor as he passed by my hiding spot, a long, heavy crowbar swinging at his side like a pendulum. The tension was so thick it felt like I was breathing underwater, and every time the furnace kicked on with a low roar, I used the noise to shift my weight and get a better look at the coal chute window. It was located high up on the wall, near the ceiling, and I would need to climb a stack of old paint cans to reach it without making a sound. I waited for him to move toward the laundry room, and then I began my slow, agonizing ascent, my fingers trembling as I gripped the cold metal of the cans. Just as I reached the latch of the small window, the man stopped walking and went completely silent, a silence so absolute that I could hear the blood rushing through my ears. "I can hear your heart beating, kid. It's a very distinct sound when everything else is quiet," he said, and I felt a cold hand wrap around my ankle and yank me downward with a violent force. I screamed as I hit the concrete floor, the air rushing out of my lungs in a painful gasp as the man hovered over me with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. He raised the crowbar, but in that moment of pure desperation, I reached out and grabbed a heavy glass jar of old nails from the shelf next to me and smashed it against the side of his head. The jar shattered, sending a spray of glass and metal into his face, and he recoiled with a roar of pain, clutching his eyes as he stumbled backward into a pile of boxes. I didn't wait to see if he was unconscious. I scrambled back up the paint cans and threw myself through the coal chute window, the narrow metal frame scraping my chest as I squeezed through. I landed in the cold, wet mulch of the garden and didn't stop running until I reached the street, waving my arms frantically at a passing patrol car that was doing its nightly rounds. The officers tackled the man as he tried to climb out the same window I had just escaped from. His face covered in small cuts and his eyes filled with a blind, senseless rage. I sat on the curb, watching the blue and red lights reflect off the "for sale" sign in our front yard, and I knew right then that I would never be able to sleep in that house again. Every time I see an open house sign now, I don't see a beautiful home or a new beginning. I see a map for a predator and a trap waiting to be sprung. I learned that the most dangerous thing about a house isn't the ghosts in the walls, but the living people you invite inside through the front door. I am currently holding my breath behind the thick velvet curtains of the dining room, watching a tall man in a bright yellow rain poncho stand on my front porch for the third time in 40 minutes. The rain is coming down in sheets, blurring the world beyond the glass, but I can see the outline of a large, heavy box tucked under his arm and a digital clipboard in his other hand. He isn't knocking anymore. He is simply standing there, staring at the doorbell camera with a wide, unblinking expression that feels like a physical threat through the wood of the door. My parents are at a charity gala downtown and won't be home until after midnight, leaving me to deal with a suburban neighborhood that feels eerily deserted during the storm. At first, I thought he was just a dedicated courier trying to meet a quota, but something about the way he arrived in an unmarked white sedan instead of a corporate van made my skin crawl. When I originally spoke to him through the intercom, he told me that I needed to sign for a high-value package for my father, but his voice was too smooth, too rehearsed, and he didn't even ask for my name. I had politely told him to leave the package on the porch, but he insisted that the insurance required a physical signature and a photo of my ID, which is a detail I know is not standard for our usual delivery services. When I refused to open the door, he didn't leave. He just walked back to his car and sat there with the engine idling, the headlights cutting through the rain like the eyes of a predator. I thought about calling my parents, but the power had flickered out 10 minutes ago, and my phone was at 5% battery with no way to charge it until the grid came back online. The tension in the house has reached a breaking point because I just heard the faint, wet slap of footsteps moving away from the front door and toward the side of the house where the kitchen windows are located. This isn't a delivery man. He is a hunter who is testing every perimeter of this house to see how much of a struggle I am going to put up. I moved into the kitchen, keeping low to the ground to avoid being seen through the glass, and I saw his face pressed against the window pane, his eyes darting around the dark interior of our home. He pulled a small, thin wire from his pocket and began to work it into the seal of the window, his movements quiet and professional, showing a level of skill that no ordinary person should possess. I realized that the package he was carrying was likely just a prop to get me to open the door, and now that the ruse had failed, he was moving to a more direct and violent approach. My heart was hammering so hard against my ribs that I felt dizzy, but I knew that if I panicked now, I wouldn't have the clarity to defend myself. I reached for the heavy cast iron skillet on the stove, feeling the cold weight of the metal in my hand, and I retreated back into the shadows of the hallway as the window lock finally gave way with a sickening snap. The man slid the window open and climbed inside, the sound of his wet poncho hitting the floor sounding like a wet shroud being dropped into a grave. He didn't turn on a flashlight. He stood perfectly still for a long minute, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness while he listened for the sound of my breathing. "I know you're in here, and I know your phone is dead because I've been watching the signal booster on your roof flicker out," he said, his voice low and vibrating with a terrifying sense of confidence. I realized then that this wasn't a random hit. He had been studying our house and our habits, waiting for a night when the storm would provide the perfect cover for his crimes. He began to walk through the kitchen, his boots squeaking on the tile, and I realized he was heading toward the staircase to block my only path to the second floor. I had to do something to change the dynamic of the situation, so I took a deep breath and threw the heavy skillet toward the far end of the living room, where it hit a glass coffee table with a deafening crash. The man spun around and lunged toward the noise, his silhouette disappearing into the darkness of the front room while he searched for the source of the disturbance. In that split second, I sprinted for the basement door, which was tucked behind a decorative screen near the pantry, and I slipped inside just as I heard his boots hitting the hardwood behind me. I flew down the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps, and I ducked into the small crawl space behind the furnace where we keep the emergency supplies. I could hear him reaching the top of the basement stairs, his breathing now heavy and ragged with frustration as he realized I had slipped through his fingers again. "You're only making this harder on yourself, kid. The police aren't coming in this weather and nobody can hear you scream over the thunder," he shouted, the words echoing down into the dark basement like a curse. He started to descend the stairs, one slow step at a time, the wood groaning under his weight while I fumbled in the dark for anything that could help me escape. My hand landed on a small, heavy canister of bear spray that my father keeps for our camping trips, and I gripped it like it was a lifeline. I watched the beam of his flashlight sweep across the concrete floor, the light getting closer and closer to the furnace until I could see the muddy toes of his boots just a few feet away. Just as he reached out to pull back the insulation where I was hiding, I stepped out and sprayed the entire canister directly into the opening of his poncho, the stinging chemical cloud filling the small space instantly. The man let out a choked, strangled cry and fell backward, dropping his flashlight and his digital clipboard as he clawed at his eyes and throat. I didn't wait to see if he was incapacitated. I scrambled up the stairs and burst out through the kitchen window he had used to enter, not caring about the rain or the cold. I ran across the yard and climbed the fence into our neighbor's property, pounding on their back door until their porch lights flickered on and I saw the familiar face of Mr. Henderson through the glass. The police arrived 20 minutes later and found the man still wandering blindly in our basement, the bear spray having completely disoriented him enough to keep him from finding the exit. It turns out he was a wanted felon who specialized in scouting high-end homes during storms, using the delivery man disguised to see who was home alone and who was vulnerable. I am safe now, but every time I hear the sound of a heavy box being dropped on a porch or the squeak of a wet boot on a tile floor, I feel that same cold dread wash over me.